Hey there everyone, Paul from FX Fitness Bristol here again, and welcome to another Coach's Conversation. In today's conversation, we're going to be talking about pre and post workout nutrition and whether it's that important for you to get the results that you want from your training. Our coaches will be discussing what to eat, when to eat it, and how best to fuel yourself pre and post workout. Remember, if you like this video, please slap a like on it, click the subscribe button, and check out all the links in the description box below.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's Coach's Conversation. This week we've all been asked a lot about pre and post workout nutrition. You know, people are starting to get into somewhat consistent routines with exercise now, especially at home, getting their own kit together, and they've been asking, are there things that they can do with food to kind of get the most out of their session? So we thought we'd kind of go into some of the nuts and bolts on this. You know, is it worthwhile? And if so, how are we going to implement it kind of from ideals into what's realistic into actual everyday application. So thankfully, I'm joined today by Andy and Milo, as usual. So I'd like to open up. Andy, let me go to you first. Is it worth it? Does it matter? Like, you know, where do you start?
I mean, that's a really good question. And there's lots to talk about, to unpack as to, you know, the effects of pre and post workout nutrition. But, you know, I'm sure if there's people out there who have been following us for a little while, they'll not be surprised by this answer. And that is, unless you have a lot of other things dialed in, you know, pre, intra, and post workout nutrition is a lower order priority, in my opinion. So if we aren't if we aren't consistently putting together good, healthy meals in the first place, you know, you're not going to see any difference really in performance or how you look in the mirror just because you've got, you know, your pre, intra, and post workout nutrition dialed in. If you're not eating really, you know, really healthily and really well outside of that, it doesn't matter at all. So there's other priorities, in my opinion. First, sleep, nutrition, all these kinds of things that, you know, once you're dialed in and you're kind of you're getting into that area, being kind of intermediate or advanced with your fitness and your nutrition and your training, then that's a conversation to have. But until then, other things take priority.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So we're basically saying that to get to the point that we want to be utilizing or thinking about what we're eating pre and post, for now, pre and post, intra is obviously a more complex topic. We're pre and post for now. We want to assume that people are eating a relatively decent and whole food diet. They've got consistent eating times through the day. They've got their stress in line. They've got their exercise in line. They've got their sleep in line. They've essentially achieved what we continue to call the basic lifestyle guidelines. So yeah, I agree with that entirely. I think especially because there was so much discussion before about, you know, the anabolic window. You've got to get this in 30 minutes post session or 90 minutes post session and all this stuff. And then obviously more sites came out to say actually that's actually not true so much. It's like, as long as you get the right amount in the day, it probably doesn't matter so much about if and when. But there are maybe some things that we can do to ensure, even if this person's getting good stuff in the day, maybe there are considerations about timing and certain macronutrients that we can kind of, let's just call it, get the most out of a session. So if we go on the assumption that we're talking to people that have those basics locked down, Milo, can you start us off with some ideas around maybe some ideals of pre-workout nutrition?
Yeah, definitely. I think, you know, you've got to look in between that sort of like 90 to maybe 90 minute to 2 hour windows before you work out. It's about just eating a meal, which might not be the biggest meal, but it's about balancing, you know, a balance between protein, for example, like turkey, fish, eggs, maybe some dairy, and some healthy fats. Again, olive oil, nuts, avocado, eggs, things like that. And then perhaps having some complex carbs as well on the side. So vegetables, potatoes, or rice. And I think, you know, the aim of what we're trying to do here is our nutrition should make us be able to sustain our energy for our workout, boost performance, you know, give us the hydration side. One thing I didn't mention there is it's important to obviously hydrate as well. You know, getting, you know, maybe half a litre of water in maybe before, not immediately before, but within the hour and a half before you train. And with all the aim of this is to hopefully speed up recovery and preserve muscle mass during your sessions.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That was the thinking that I had. This is actually pre-workout nutrition starts 48 hours before the workout, because that's what hydration status is, isn't it? Like when we're talking hydration, we're not saying, I've drunk 1 glass of water, I am hydrated. It's an ongoing process. So that's a great point with hydration, because that's often missed with workout or like pre-workout nutrition. Yet it's one of the biggest things. If we're dehydrated, we have low energy and all the cellular functions don't work and we're not as good as in the session, not to mention our digestion's pants. But I think that's a good point. So like with the ideal, we're saying we want balanced nutrients to sustain energy. Mm-hmm. And ideally, we want to have enough time before the workout to be able to appropriately digest that food, aren't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, I think those are good principles. We want a mix of decent, healthy foods that we can that sustain, our regular day, but we just want to have enough time in between that and the session to be able to actually break down and assimilate those, and not be going into a workout with kind of stuff in our belly.
I think actually that's a really good point. If I can just jump in real quick,
go for it.
I think something that we need to consider in that is the type of training that you are doing. So we need to understand and recognize that food is a time commitment. So food is going to sit in your stomach. Now it's a sliding scale, but anywhere from 2 to 4, but probably closer to 4 hours. So if you're going to go do an endurance, a run, or if you're going to go do like a hard, lactic session, anaerobic session where you're really, hard 3-minute intervals, 2-minute intervals, when you're really digging deep, assuming we are speaking to people here who are at that level now, because otherwise we probably wouldn't be talking about, nutrition in this way. I would say that, 4 hours, 3-4 hours is really, in terms of that balanced meal, depending on the type of your training, needs to be thought about. Resistance training, 2 hours, 90 minutes, great. That's a great timeline. But if you're looking at doing hard anaerobic training where you're digging deep, you do not want food sloshing around in your stomach, and it's going to be in there for 4 hours. So that's just something to take in mind. 4 hours before a hard anaerobic session, intervals, have a meal, an hour before, we could look at a piece of fruit or just some simple sugars, simple carbohydrates. It's not going to sit in there and be an issue for you. But that's something to consider, because the last thing you want in, aerobic or anaerobic stuff is gastric upset, because then it just, I've done it. Trust me from experience. I have lost my lunch all over the floor doing stuff like that. So something to consider. The type of training is going to dictate here exactly how we approach our pre-workout nutrition.
Yeah, great add-on. Because in all of this, it depends on, what I think, as we'll continue to say, it depends, doesn't it? It's when people are having that more intensity, that's a bigger component of this. Exactly as you said, we're dripping glycogen, or we're dripping sugars essentially a little bit sooner to fuel that session, but we're making sure that we're not really taking on solids a big time before the session. But also, so we can recognize, if we're looking at least the people we primarily talk to, people who are doing some form of resistance and aerobic training, that kind of 90 to 2 hour window is pretty cool. So moving into, if that's the ideal for pre-workout, Andy, can you give us some ideas of what might be ideal post-workout?
Post-workout, yes. I think, again, actually, you referenced, the anabolic window and all this kind of stuff. I think post-workout, what we ideally want to do is recognize, and again, I keep kind of reiterating the point, but it will depend a little bit on the style of training that you do. So if you're doing a really hard anaerobic session, you're really digging deep into your system, it's going to take you longer to get back to that parasympathetic state, like get back down to relaxing and being able to digest nutrients properly. Resistance training might not take as long, but ideally, one could have something easily digestible 30 or 60 minutes post-workout. So like, really, like a shake or something that's really easily digestible in terms of carbohydrates and protein. But I think personally the most important thing outside, because I don't, you know, outside of things like shakes, and I'm a bit, it depends, maybe, I don't know. We're talking about a real meal here. We're talking like, you know, 2 hours, an hour to 2 hours post-workout is when the body has come down and relaxed to the point where blood flow has gone back into the gut after being pushed out to the extremities when you're lifting weights and all that kind of stuff, and we can properly digest and assimilate those nutrients. So, and again, I don't know if anyone else out there has this experience. If I do a hard session, I don't feel like eating, you know, for a good hour or two. I don't want to. And I think it's probably because your body's in a state that it's just not prepared to do that. All the blood is everywhere else, not here where you want to digest. So to really actually boil that down to from rambling completely for the last 3 minutes, an hour to 2 hours, 2 hours, maybe closer to 2 hours, have that well-balanced, as Milo said, well-balanced meal, your carbohydrates, proteins, a little bit of fat, get that meal in you. I think that's the most important thing.
Yeah. So again, this is something that it's kind of in the face of what we were told 10 years ago, which was that, you know, post-session, you've got this anabolic window, you need to smash in food quickly. And we now know that, like, digestion is on the branch of the nervous system that's rest and digest. And exactly as you've said there, especially if we're training somewhat intensely, and that can be perception-based, we're pushed into a situation where we can't digest. And there's so many aspects of that that's hormonally. We're seeing a lot of stuff with like how cortisol is responsible for certain aspects of the digestive system. And so basically, yeah, if we then suddenly cane in a load of nutrients, we're probably not in a good space to digest them, you know, to produce enough of the enzymes and acids that we need to break down those foods and assimilate them. If you want to get really specific about this, I've had people who are, and again, we're talking about ideal at the moment. So if we start to push towards real life and not ideal, I've had some people who are closest to the ability, you know, personal trainers who are close to the ability to eat ideally and choose where their session goes in the day, but they're still on a time frame. So to find out relative to them when the best time was, I get their heart rate. So we do resting heart rate, so we know that generally, kind of, especially for more trained individuals, it's good to know resting heart rate anyway. See where the heart rate went post session, and then they couldn't eat until it got back down to consistent resting heart rate. So that's a really specific way you can find out, well, actually for me, I can down regulate really quickly post session. But, you know, for some people, it takes them 2.5 hours to get into a position where they're actually in an ability to digest the food they're taking in.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And you were saying kind of like a big meal or just a regular meal. Are we still thinking along the ideas of we ideally probably still want to consider the same amount of protein, fats, and carbohydrates?
Is this directed at me or at Milo?
I'll direct it to you because it was your point. Yeah.
Okay. So my thoughts generally are, and this actually could be open to debate. So please, like Milo and Danny, if you guys are not, you know, push back, you know, this is a discussion after all. I tend to think that post-workout, pre and post-workout, in that peri-workout window, generally speaking, I think, you know, fats have a place, but should be kept a little bit lower towards a minimum because they slow digestion of everything else. So I would be more inclined to go, you know, lean proteins and some carbohydrates. And like veg is always a good thing. So throw lots of veg in there. And then fats, perhaps there because it's part of a balanced meal, but I would focus more on the proteins and the carbohydrates for recovery, and then fats, while important, but maybe a little bit less in that window. And then fats for the rest of the day can be kind of spread out on either end, or maybe front loaded before if you happen to train in the evening. But I think, like, generally, yes, a well-balanced meal, but with a little bit less emphasis on fats for me is how I would do it, because of the slowing of the digestion. And you want those nutrients, you want to get them in there after you've trained, you know, so get them assimilated.
Milo, your thoughts?
I'm very much on the same pattern. For me, it's about, you know, when you do feel hungry after training, just focus a meal on, you know, lean protein, plenty of veg, and some carbs. I think, you know, you don't need to make it more complicated than that, really. And I think, you know, again, you know, we're focusing a lot here on people who are, you know, quite advanced, I think, in the fitness world. Whereas, you know, I think you've also got to link it back to, you know, people who maybe just trying to be fit and healthy. You know, this sort of stuff is as important, but the actual timing of things isn't as important. It's just making sure that you have balanced meals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, awesome. So we're coming out to the same point of basically just real food.
Yeah.
And again, relative to the individual, their digestion and their activity, we may want to tweak certain micronutrient ratios. But otherwise, we're saying eat before, have it well digested, train, get to a position where you can down-regulate so that the next meal that you take in, which is a whole meal, like the same kind of meal, you can digest that well as well.
Totally.
So if that's this lovely ideal situation, which let's face it, for most people is unrealistic, especially for anyone who's, kind of general population, probably training either early morning or evening / late into the night. So I think let's go into basically some of the ways that we kind of duct tape these ideas, or some of the ways that we can create strategies for those individuals so that they can, number one, be well fueled, but also have adequate recovery from their session, or potentially not have what might be the ideal post-workout recovery meal ruin, let's say, their sleep or their energy for the day, or anything like that. So if we go, let's go start on the day first. So if you're a client who's coming in and training at 6:30 a.m. in the morning, let's say they're waking up most realistically 5:45. That'd be a nice early for most people. Yeah. Milo, run us through kind of what you'd have that person potentially eating, or you might be thinking for pre-workout nutrition for those guys.
So I think the first thing is to let's step on yesterday. So I think, when you should be having that balanced meal maybe 2 to 3 hours before you go to bed. And really that should, what you eat there, because it's balanced, should sustain you for the next day. However, there's also something that I would recommend if we're training that early. We don't want to be getting up 2-3 hours before we train. So just focus on, if you need something in the morning when you wake up, just something like berries, some really quick digesting fruit, a banana, something like that, which is enough to get you through that hour session that you have in the morning. And then just, again, after you finish, it's just about having that balanced meal, having those protein, having some fat, having some carbs and vegetables with it.
Yeah, awesome. No, yeah, I completely agree with that. Andy, do you have anything to add there? Are you pretty happy with that?
Not really. I think you probably saw me thumbs up when he said it. I just think that's that's a perfect point. I think I think a lot of people that don't, I'm going to ramble. A lot of people, they often fail to realize or don't think about the fact that, food is if we're talking mouth to full digestion, it's like a 36-hour investment, but immediately for absorbing, it's 4, 5, 6 hour, 7 hour, 8 hour investment, and that food is still in your intestines being absorbed. So nutrition for the next day is set up the night before, 100%. So having that meal, like Milo said before, that'll get you through. Yeah,
great principles. So considering if we're having an early morning session, what we're eating before bed, because that's going to be part of that. And then if we are having let's say a relatively intense or a more intense session, we might want to be considerate of getting some easily digestible carbohydrates in, like berries, banana, something that's kind of just easy and quick into the bloodstream. So again, let's follow on from that a little bit. And this is a big one, and it varies massively. But that person's finished their session at 7:30, gone home, had a shower, and they're probably straight off to work for many people. So he's probably going to not get to sit down and have a proper meal. What do you guys think around potentially strategies for that person to have for post-workout nutrition? Andy, I'll open that to you.
Okay. That's a great point, because we're looking at real world here, right? And people, they train and then they're off to work. I think we can talk about strategies to kind of, work out timing so that people can ideally sit down and have a meal. But if that is not possible, I think that we need to focus on things that are going to be, easily digestible for the body. I'm always a little bit hesitant, because I don't like the idea of people relying on things like shakes, but it could be a lesser of evils kind of point. Like if someone really doesn't have the time, really, and they're moving and they're on to work and they're going, maybe some kind of a shake with some protein, with some fats, with lots of veg in there, to kind of as something to get in that we know is healthy, is good, as opposed to stopping at the drive-thru and getting an Egg McMuffin on the way to work, But equally, depending on people's work, if they are able to somehow prep meals or prep some food and bring food to work. And if they maybe work at a desk and they have the ability to sit there and eat their food at their desk, you know, they're in work, that's a possibility. But I think that one is going to be, it's very individual, as we always kind of say. You know, some people might genuinely need to have a shake on board. Others might have the freedom to prep some food, a proper post-workout meal, and take that into work. And so that can really depend.
I think you've nailed that. Like, ideal situation is that they have time, or I would say primarily space. There's a lot of people who, like, if they're at their desk, they're working. So we know digestion is not going to occur. So unless we're considering really digestible foods on their plate, it's a no-go. But yeah, ideal situation, they have an environment and time to sit down and properly digest food at work. Perfect. But if not, 100%. Like, if you are looking to get nutrients in and you know digestion is not going to be 100% of that time, then let's look at things that are better digestible or more digestible. And I think some form of shake, whether that be in the form of a smoothie where we can get some greens and some healthy, some nutrients in there, and then some form of, we can get fat in there easily as well through avocados or nut milks or butters and stuff like that. But also some protein from a source that we tolerate well, whether that's a vegan source, dairy, or some form of hydrolyzed beef, which I know me and Milo are both suffering through at the moment.
Tried it. Yeah, it's a bit, yeah.
I'd say it doesn't taste like beef. I'm pretty sure it doesn't taste like beef, but I've got it in my head that it tastes like beef.
It tastes like beef?
Yeah.
Just side note, do you guys notice I had one ages ago, and when I mix it up, it would froth quite a lot. Is that something that is still an issue? Because this was early days of beef protein when I tried it.
I just block it out of my mind. The less you think about it, the better.
Yeah, right.
No, 100%. But yeah, if those are the situations where a shake can come in really handy, and we shouldn't poo-poo that, because if the reality is we can't change that environment or that time, then we don't just go, well, shakes are bad for you, don't use them. Yeah. We have to utilize it because it's the most effective tool.
Yeah, I do think just on that point. I mean, I have used this with one of my clients before. And this could be a whole separate strategy and conversation around meal prep. But if you have the ability to prep a meal or a few meals throughout the week that are designed as, you know, your post-workout meals, and then, you know, that's a strategy you can use to say, okay, I've got it ready, bang it in the microwave. Take 15 minutes to sit down at my house before I leave for work and eat it, as opposed to having to come home and cook a whole meal. You know, that I think that there's probably a lot of people out there that if they really sat back and had a look at their routine in their day, they could find 15 or 20 minutes if something is already prepared to have that meal. But again, that's more of an ideal situation. So.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, I think we could go on about this forever, couldn't we? It's a problem that has to be problem solved, basically.
Yeah.
But it's relative. But I think those are some good ideas on that. So if we go into the evening worker or the evening workouter, and I'm going to separate this into two, just because the trends that I see is you will either have people come straight from work, or you will have people who will go home, have dinner, and then come and train. So let's go with the earlier evening first. Andy, can you give me some considerations for someone who's probably finishing at 5 p.m. and they're in the gym at 5:30? Kind of what's your thinking about how you're going to fuel them? Post-workout's probably a bit easier, so cover that anyway, but kind of what are you thinking in a way to get them well fueled for that workout?
Again, it will always, you know, the type of workout will dictate, but in a way, but generally speaking, you know, a lot of what we've talked about, if someone is coming, you know, straight from work and they don't have an opportunity to have, you know, in an ideal world, maybe they have time to have a meal at, say, 3 o'clock, you know, at work. But if they don't have that, then, you know, 30 to 60 minutes before, like we've talked about and mentioned, something like fruits or some kind of snack to just kind of get you through the workout can be really helpful. You know, I actually tend to think that things like fruit and berries and stuff are the best. I mean, you can have nuts and things, but that'll be slower digested with all the fats in there. So, you know, it's not dissimilar to having someone wake up in the morning. So actually, let me rephrase, make sure that you have a great meal at lunchtime, because most people, you know, you'll have a lunch break. That's where the meal comes in. Have a great meal at lunchtime. that will extend you through, hopefully, but maybe with a snack of some berries or fruit an hour before the workout. Usually people can manage that on their way to the gym or at work, something like that. And I think that's probably your best look at it, really. The lunchtime meal becomes really big, because that's, you look at the timing of it, that's not too dissimilar to that evening meal you have and then training first thing in the morning. So lunchtime, very important. Balanced meal, just like we've talked about, lean proteins, carbohydrates, vegetables, all that kind of good stuff. And then like a fruit kind of snack an hour before to get you through it. As for post, I mean, if you're training earlier, you're in a little bit of a better position, because you do have to consider, though, having that big meal. So if you're training at 5:30, say you train till 7, get home 8 o'clock, big meal, bedtime, I don't know, 10 o'clock. I mean, you need to be aware of having a big meal, complex meal right before bedtime or a couple hours before, because that can really disrupt sleep. So
you just gave everyone your 90-minute sessions, though.
Yes, true. That's true. So if we're looking at an hour, it changes. So I'll wrap it up by saying this: important, but less of a consideration if you're training at 5 earlier than it is if you come in and train at 7 o'clock. That's a whole other conversation. We can give that one to Milo, because I know I've been talking a lot.
No, I think you've nailed that. Like, same principles. Nail lunch. Have that, because if you really nail lunch, that will take energy through. Again, depending on the intensity, potentially snack on some sort of fruit or easily digestible carbohydrate beforehand. And then post doesn't matter so much. It does matter if you're going to have a massive meal, be considerate of the bedtime, but you're probably training at a time where dinner is going to be your post-workout meal.
Yeah.
And it's hopefully, if your routines are good enough throughout the rest of the day, which again is one of our basic lifestyle guidelines. So we're assuming that's kind of locked down already with these people. Mm-hmm. That's already a great meal that it's going to be a mimic of lunch, where we're just getting a whole food, carbohydrate, fats and proteins, and that's going to properly replenish you. And hopefully we've got enough time in between that. And maybe we need some strategies to down-regulate a little bit quicker with that example, but we're taking care of that meal. So that's cool. So Milo, run us through what you would think for someone who's going to finish work, go home and have dinner, and then they're going to train a bit later. Mm-hmm. What are your considerations for those guys?
So I think it's obviously the time period between eating and training. Again, if we're finishing at 5 and training at 7, we're probably most likely, maybe we're not going to get food done until 6 p.m. So I think, in that period, it's, yes, okay, we want to get some stuff in, but they're going to be quicker digesting stuff, or it's going to be a smaller meal than perhaps your big meal. Because if you're eating an hour before your training, you're most likely not going to be able to digest it ideally. I think just on the flip side of the end of that, okay, yes, eating at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the evening is not ideal, but you're going to want to eat something, aren't you? So I think that's where that meal, you kind of just focus on having some more easily digestible protein, as well as some vegetables. Just fill that on your plate, because it's going to give you what you need to recover. I think, as I said, it's not ideal in that situation, because you've kind of got this where you're training is perhaps where you should be eating, but it's just about having to monitor things around that. So find a portion size before training that kind of works for you, which is probably going to be a little bit less than perhaps a normal dinner would be if you weren't training at 7.
Yeah, I think those are great points. This is the avatar that is, we have to duct tape the most, because from just an evolutionary biology standpoint, it's the most inappropriate time to train.
Yeah.
There are so many things that come into, like, essentially, if you want to make that happen and you want to consider the nutrition around that, you have to remove yourself from what you currently believe was going to be your nutrition. Mm-hmm. I think points that we could take from our other ones was that, like, maybe if we know we have to get X amount of calories in a day and we're going to train at this time and we're worried about pre and post nutrition, we're probably going to have to nail and have larger amounts at breakfast and lunchtime, because we're having to eat less in this evening period in front and back. Other things you said, so yeah, being considerate of that meal you're going to have beforehand, depending on how much time you're going to have to digest it. So it's probably going to have to be smaller. And then post, big one, like if you're already finishing later, We want to be having stuff that's so easy to digest. Because if our stomach's trying to break down steak while we're lying in bed, like, we're not getting good sleep. So I think the real recommendation for that demographic is stop training at that time at night.
If possible, yeah.
If possible. Like,
I think I'll share something as well that I've found from personal experience. And when Milo touched on, finding that meal size that works for you pre-workout, one thing to consider, and I've only really recently finding this is, we talk about chewing our food is like this thing, and actually, I'll admit, hand on heart, like, I've only really started to see really how important that is. I can have a small meal, and if I inhale it and don't breathe like I used to do a lot, I'll feel bloated and I'll feel rough and I won't digest very well. And that will last for quite a while. Whereas if I really am mindful about chewing my food and properly digesting it in my mouth first, I can have a larger meal and feel, when I finish that meal, I feel like I could go for an easy jog after, right? So something to consider. I know it seems super basic, but chewing your food can make a difference as well in terms of your pre-workout and getting in a little bit of a larger meal, perhaps, and feeling okay and doing that, and then easing some of the pressure pre and post then on the other parts of your nutrition, right? So something to think about. Chew your food. Very basic, but as someone who is a former inhaler of food, I can tell you it makes a difference.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I think that's a great way to wrap that up with a reminder that if we're looking at pre and post workout nutrition, as so many people do, if they haven't got the basic lifestyle guidelines, so let's run it through the person. They're not sleeping consistently at the same times. They've got bad quality sleep. They've got high stress, they're eating somewhat processed food, and they are inhaling it. They are not chewing it and properly digesting it. They're dehydrated, and they're being somewhat inconsistent with exercise. If these guys or girls are being so invested in the idea of, well, what BCAA should I be taking beforehand? What pre-workout shake should I be taking? What caffeine should I be ingesting? Or what special, carbohydrate ratio shake should I be taking post? There is so much reward they will get from sorting out the lifestyle stuff that will make that a workout far more effective than keep trying to duct tape the hell out of a system that is not working at all. So I think that's a really nice way of bringing that to a close there, Andy, because these are strategies that people can use, and they can see that, to be honest, the basicness of which we need to be considering pre and post workout nutrition. But also remember, this is to go on top of everything else that we work on. So, guys, I hope that was helpful. I think we got some good content in there. As always, if you have any questions or anything you'd like us to cover, please just drop us a message. We always want to hear what you guys want to hear. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe. But otherwise, guys, thank you for joining me. Thanks to Andy and Milo. Say goodbye.
See ya.
See you later, guys.